Okay, is everyone able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. And when I have the PowerPoint on, I don't always see everybody, so I apologize in advance if I don't see you or I look like I'm not talking directly at you. If you do have questions like in the moment and it needs to be answered, please either put it in the chat or do like a hand raise or something to let me know. If I don't see it, hopefully Kate can help me out and stop me. But if not, I can certainly take questions at the end as well. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I got a chance to meet with some of you already, so it's great to see some of you again. I really appreciate having this opportunity to share a little bit of information that I feel is really pertinent to children, school-age children, as well as youth. I know ADHD is a very common neurodevelopmental disorder, but sometimes there's a lot of misconceptions about that. So I'm happy to share this information. Before we get started, I'd like to, introduce myself. Again, thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. My name is Wyndone Wellens. Please call me Wynn. Um, just kind of a quick introduction about myself. I moved to Montgomery County exactly 1 year ago. So I am actually a newbie to the area, but I have enjoyed living here, getting to know people, working here as well. I actually started out, living in Baltimore after I got married, and then we moved to Georgia and lived there for 23 years and decided it was time to go back to the area. And I think this is probably where we will end up. So it's been a sort of a full circle moment for myself and my husband. Um, I am currently a school psychologist serving Montgomery County Public Schools. I am assigned to 3 elementary schools. Um, and, prior to, moving and working here, I was in Georgia training as well as have had experience working in schools for over 16 years as a former special education teacher and now a school psychologist. I'm nationally certified as well as state certified to work in schools, and also I'm licensed to work in clinical settings as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow. I see that a few more people have just joined us, so welcome. Okay, all right. So just to give us a little bit of direction for our talk for tonight, I'd like to share some of the objectives to kind of give us a little bit of an orientation for what to expect. Typically I like to start off with providing some information on diagnostic criteria for ADHD. I think that term gets thrown around quite a bit, and sometimes we say, oh, that kid's got ADHD or he's so ADHD. But there are very specific criteria that individuals would have to meet in order to be fully diagnosed with that disorder. Also, I'd like to provide some information on recent CDC statistics about ADHD in children, and just to kind of clarify what ADHD really is, and just to kind of highlight some of the challenges that we see quite often in children as well as youth. Obviously, adults are also diagnosed with ADHD, sometimes early, sometimes late in life. But for tonight, the focus is going to be in school age, as well as, adolescent populations. And then I also would like to share some of the challenges that we see quite a bit in home and school settings, and also some solutions and possible strategies to address those concerns in both school and home settings. And then also, because I am a school psychologist, I love to share information about how to get support for and services for your child if your child has ADHD, or if you're suspecting that your child has ADHD in schools. Okay, so that's kind of our goals for tonight. I'll probably stop after each section to see if there are any questions. If not, I'll just keep going. All right. All right, so oh, there's more people coming in, so let me just admit them for some reason. Oh, oh,
I will admit them, don't worry.
okay, sorry about that. I was like trying to get people and then it messed up my slide. Okay, we're back to so here I do want to talk a little bit about, obviously some adults are diagnosed late in life, or maybe they were diagnosed when they were younger. But symptoms of ADHD can really change over the course of time. Um, you know, for specifically to meet criteria for ADHD, we want to see that there are 6 or more symptoms for children age 16 or under. For teens, ages 17 or older, it's typically 5 or more symptoms of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity. I will say that our most recent DSM-5 is now in its somewhat of a 6th version, but it's not quite the 6th version yet. It's in the text revision phase. This came out in 2022. There's not a whole lot that's changed with regard to criteria. We do want to emphasize that the symptoms have to be present for at least 6 months. And typically we do see the presentation before age 12 in at least 2 settings. In my practice at the school, I get a lot of parents who complain about seeing symptoms of ADHD in the home setting. But then when I consult with the teachers or administrators, they're not seeing it. And so for those situations, it's more environmentally specific. That particular child may or may not necessarily meet full criteria for ADHD. And so that's sort of a tricky thing sometimes to kind of navigate with parents and help them understand what that looks like and why it's more challenging for certain setting and not for others. We also want to see a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that is really, negatively impacting their functioning, their daily functioning. So of course, for children or youth, the areas of function that we mainly look at would be, of course, home and school. And, of course, social functioning as well. And then, although ADHD may have comorbidity with other types of mental disorders, we want to make sure that we are not overlooking other types of mental health disorder that could better explain some of the symptoms. Okay. I do want to point out that there are 3 different types of ADHD. Most folks may or may not be familiar with that. The one presentation is inattention. The second presentation is hyperactivity, impulsivity. And then the third presentation is the combined type. And this is where you see both inattention as well as hyperactivity and impulsivity. So I do want to kind of give you just an idea of what some of the inattention symptoms look like. Most often you see that in children, they have difficulty paying attention, especially to topics or activities that are of low interest or non-prefer. And so they tend to tune out, or they may shift their attention to something else. We also see that a lot of times they are rushing through things, rushing through their work, making a lot of careless mistakes. They have trouble sustaining attention for a task or activity, and that they seem to not be listening when you're talking to them. We also see that, and this is what I hear quite a bit in the school setting, is that, teachers will say, oh, Johnny, was not able to complete schoolwork, and this is on a regular basis. They're not able to complete tasks, they can't get started, they tend to get highly distracted. They also have trouble with organization, keeping up with materials, losing personal items on a regular basis. And then we also see a lot of avoidant behaviors. And typically these avoidant behaviors or procrastinating is related to tasks or activities or work that require a lot of mental effort over long periods of time. So they really have trouble with persistence or vigilance, and that they tend to give up very quickly or easily. And then, of course, the easily being very easily distracted as well, and is very forgetful. So you may tell them 5 or 6 times, don't forget, you need to pack your soccer shoes because you have practice after school. And they may say, yeah, yeah, yeah. And next thing you know, they forgot their soccer shoes. So those are some, often the symptoms that we see for children who have the inattentive type. And this is just a quick visual of, what that looks like. It's sort of like this vicious cycle where it's kind of going around and around a circle. And I do want to make sure that I give credit to some of this information I gather from my National Association for School Psychologists Convention. And some of this information was gathered through a workshop that I did with Rebecca Brown. So I do want to make sure I give her credit for that. Okay. With regard to symptoms that are considered to be hyperactivity or impulsivity, tendencies, we often see younger children tend to have a really high level of energy. They can be very restless. They seem like they're constantly fidgeting, moving around, wiggly. They have trouble staying seated. They're constantly up and down. Now, these symptoms may look differently as the child grows and develops and matures. So the sort of hyperactivity is a little bit less pronounced and less obvious. You may see adults who have hyperactivity. They may be tapping their legs all the time, or constantly be rocking, or constantly be fidgeting with things to kind of help them focus. So it may come across that way over time, but typically in school age children, we do see that they are very physically restless. Outside, you see a lot of physical activities where they are very much into the running, the climbing, just very physical type of activities are the things that they're usually drawn to. And you think that after all of that physical activities, they will be exhausted, but not really. They can come back inside and they're still restless. And that's more for kids with more severe, like moderate to severe levels of ADHD. They seem like they are constantly on the go. I hear quite a lot from parents who complain to me about how their child could not even sit down to finish an entire meal. Sometimes they have to stand up to eat. They have to get up and leave their seat and come back. We also see a lot of times the high energy level comes out through speech. So you see that the child talks all the time, nonstop. This is a way for them to get out that excessive energy, or that restlessness. Also, you see them blurting out, interrupting, having a hard time waiting in line. Taking turns is really challenging. And they tend to, like, sort of like a bull in a china shop. They're just kind of charging right in, that sort of thing. So these are really common types of symptoms that we see in children. Again, this is just another fun visual I wanted to share with you all. Is, this kind of reminds me of that cartoon. I don't know if you all remember the Family Circus. Jeffy in that cartoon, like, like he'll go from one destination to another, and you would think he'll go from point A to point B, but he meanders. He'll go to A to B, get sidetracked, start meeting other people, and then next thing you know, he's gone all around town before he gets to where he needs to go. And this is sort of like that. Is, you see children who are, neurotypical, is able to, let's say, tell a story from beginning to middle to end in a linear fashion. They're very focused, they get to the point, and they finish their story. Children with ADHD, they tend to meander. They start, but then they forgot they left out some information, so they backtrack, and then they start again. And then in the middle of the story, they may get distracted by something. So they start talking off topic, and then next you know, they come back to their story and they forgot where they left off. So you get the idea. That's sort of kind of what we're talking about. And this is just another fun visual to show what impulsivity in children looks like. You see that, you know, here, whatever that pops up, an opportunity presents itself, and they're just going to go for it without thinking about consequences. They're just going to go for it and see what happens after that. This is very typical. All right. Any questions about diagnostic criteria before I move on to ADHD statistics? Okay. All right. So these statistics were gathered from the 2022 CDC data. And you know, it's not surprising that boys are more likely to be diagnosed than girls, almost twice as likely. You know, in my practice, I do see more boys when I am doing evaluations. And many of the boys I evaluated, you know, if teachers and parents are suspecting it, most likely, and we're seeing it in multiple settings, more likely that they are, you know, meeting criteria for ADHD. And it seemed, and the reason that it comes up quite a lot in the school setting is that it's really interfering with their learning, is interfering with their daily life at home as well. And we do see a lot of boys with a combined presentation where they're both inattentive as well as hyper and impulsive. But I do get quite a few that are girls as well. And it seems like, you know, I think more and more folks are more knowledgeable about ADHD. And so a lot of times teachers and parents are picking up on those symptoms earlier. And so it's brought to our attention. And so they're able to get that evaluation so that they're able to get services in schools. When we look at statistics broken down by demographics, we see that, you know, more Black and white children are found to have ADHD at 12%, which is slightly higher than what we typically see. You know, and then under that is American Indian, Alaska Native children, 10%, Hispanic children also 10%. And then Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander 6%, and then Asian children 4%. I don't know exactly why, you know, there's such discrepancy in different demographic groups. You know, it could just be that maybe, you know, there's different coping strategies culturally that we're not aware of. Maybe, Black and white families are more likely to kind of are more tuned to some of those symptoms and are bringing those symptoms to the attention of the school system or to their pediatricians or whatnot. So it's hard for me to kind of know exactly why those percentages are so different. We do know that about 60% of children diagnosed with ADHD have the moderate to severe kind, which means that they have more symptoms in excess of the criteria. So you have to have at least 6. Some of these children who fall under this sort of level or this moderate to severe have maybe 8 or even 9 symptoms, meaning all of those symptoms. ADHD has a high comorbidity with certain, neurodevelopmental disorders. I see that quite a bit in children with autism, as well as children with learning disabilities. Also, sometimes it's hard to tease out oppositional defiant disorder from ADHD, but they are comorbidities. There are certain nuances that do separate them out. But that would require, you know, a comprehensive evaluation in order to really, you know, kind of figure out what is what. Anxiety and depression or mood disorder also are high comorbidities for children with ADHD, as well as like developmental delays and, you know, other syndromes like Tourette's or sleep disorder. Okay. So now we're going to kind of get into the part that talks about, well, what is ADHD, right? And ADHD falls under the neurodevelopmental disorder category in the DSM, along with autism, learning disability, developmental delays, etc. And so when we talk about children who have ADHD, we talk about children with neuroatypical brain, and their brain is very much driven by interest. So we call that the interest-based brain or nervous system. Um, Typical neurotypical children understand the concept of importance and then secondary importance. And these concepts tap directly into what's called executive functioning, right? So you have to understand what's important, what's not important in order to prioritize, to plan, to organize, to kind of regulate your behaviors and know consequences and things like that. They also the concept of rewards and consequences work really well for neurotypical children because they are able to wait and to be able to earn rewards over time. And that's very motivating for them. On the flip side, children with ADHD or the interest-based nervous system, they have a really difficult time understanding the concept of importance of time and rewards and consequences. And I'm going to go into a little bit and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. But their brain is really driven by what is interesting in the moment, what is challenging, what is urgent, and what is novel. So that's what their brain is motivated and driven by. So you could have a child sitting there, in class, and suddenly they're listening to their teacher, but whatever their teacher was saying was probably not maybe something that they're really interested in. And then suddenly, out of the corner of their eye, they saw a friend whipping out a snack and zip, that's it. That's where their attention is going to go because right then and there, that's what's most interesting for them. We also see that, children with ADHD, I hear this all the time, is that they procrastinate, they put off doing things, they can't initiate, they can't get started on things. Again, driven by interest. So if whatever they're having to do is of low interest or is non-preferred, they're not going to want to do it. And so that's why they keep putting it off. And they keep putting off. And children who have already an underlying anxiety, it's hard for them to, it's sort of like a vicious cycle. They don't want to do the task, so they procrastinate. Well, they procrastinate, which drives their anxiety level even higher because they know they have to get it done eventually. The deadline is coming up, but they can't get themselves to sit down and do the work. Also, it's really challenging sometimes to assess, their cognitive abilities as well as their academic skills because it's so variable. And the variability is really dependent on their interests. So let's say you have a child who, let's say in middle school, and they have no interest in learning about the Industrial Revolution. They didn't care about it. It was boring. So they bombed their test. And then maybe several weeks later, they're on to a different unit and they're learning about something that's of high interest. Let's say they're really into World War II and they really are all about World War II. Suddenly they ace the test and they're doing phenomenally. And it's really puzzling to teachers and parents. It's like, I don't get it. 1 minute he fail a test and the next minute he's doing great. So sometimes it's really difficult to assess what they know, what they don't know. And the reason is because their brain kind of tunes out what's not interesting to them, and then they tune back in or they hyper focus on areas of interest. And so you see this variability all the time. And of course, distraction, very highly distracted because everything around them can be interesting and novel and challenging and urgent. Okay. All right. So I kind of like this visual because some of these things gives you sort of an idea of what the interest-based brain looks like in children with ADHD. First of all, we hear a lot about difficulty with executive functioning, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But the first picture shows motivation. So either they cannot get started on something because it's not something they want to do or they're not interested in it. So you see a child sitting there and not getting started on a worksheet, or they could spend hours doing something that they really enjoy. Like I hear all the time, I can't get my child to sit down for 10 minutes to do a writing worksheet, but he will spend 3 hours playing with Legos or playing video games or reading a book or whatever. So either they can't get started or they're so into whatever it is that they're into and that you can't pull them away from it. So those are the two extremes. With regard to time, their concept of time is very, very black and white. It's either now or it's not now. They are not really able to kind of see far out, like, okay, today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. That's why planning is really difficult for children with ADHD because they don't have that concept of, oh, today, I have to do X, Y, Z. Next, in 2 weeks, I have a project coming up that's due. I need to start planning on how to tackle that project. They don't have that concept. And so, you get into this vicious cycle of them waiting until the very last minute because they had 2 weeks to get it done. Of course, they didn't want to do it because it wasn't something they cared about. They procrastinated, and suddenly it's due the next day, and they're staying up all night trying to get it all done, right? You also hear a lot about children who either sleep way too much or they don't get enough sleep. With regard to sleep, I usually tell parents if your child has had a really busy day, you would think, oh, they're going to crash the minute they hit the bed. Not necessarily. Some children have, a lot going on in their brain. So it's sort of like an internal distraction. They may be lying in bed for hours, but their brain just won't shut down. They've got a lot they're thinking about. Maybe, they just came home from an exciting soccer game, and they're still thinking about that. Or maybe they just watch a movie that was scary or like an action pack or playing some video games, and suddenly they can't get to sleep. So a lot of times I do recommend that parents, they know their child best is to think about, well, how much time do you need to get your child's brain to calm down or to quiet down so that he or she is able to fall asleep at a reasonable hour. So if you want your child asleep by 9:30, 10 o'clock, maybe you have to start moving the bedtime routine to, an hour before or maybe 2 hours to get them to sort of leave all of that behind and to kind of get themselves in that physical space and that mental space where they're able to quiet their brain and to be able to relax in order to go to sleep. And then with regard to talking conversation, sometimes, as I said earlier, some children are very talkative and they cannot stop. That's how they are able to expend some of that energy. Either they're talking all the time, interrupting you, or they will zone out and they're not responding to you. So again, that's another extreme. Okay, so before I talk about challenges, I wanted to see if anybody has any questions about what I've covered so far. And I can't really see y'all, so Kate, if you're able to kind of let me know if there's any questions, that'll be great.
There's one. What elementary schools do you consult with at MCPS?
Sure, I am at 3 different schools. So I am at Cold Spring Elementary School, which is in the Wooten cluster. And then I'm at Ashburton Elementary School in North Bethesda, as well as Garrett Park in, also in that Kensington, Garrett Park area. And those 2 schools are in the the Walter Johnson cluster. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the challenges that we often see in children with ADHD. And some of these probably most of you may be pretty familiar with, but sometimes, we kind of, with regard to attention, that the name ADHD, attention deficit, is actually a misnomer. It's not true that children with ADHD cannot attend. They actually can. They can pay attention. It's just that they pick and choose what to pay attention to. And as I said before, they're able to attend to things that are urgent and novel and interesting. If it's not interesting, it's not novel, and it's not anything that they're, care about, then they will not attend. So they can actually hyper focus on a lot of things. And so that kind of taps into the first item is, picking and choosing what they want to pay attention to. Unfortunately, in the school setting, children don't get to pick what topics they're learning, right? You've got children who are having to learn all kinds of different topics. Some topics they're really into and some they're not. Neurotypical children, yes, they may not love learning about certain topics, but they're able to kind of push through that, and they're able to understand the consequence if they don't pay attention is, oh, if I don't pay attention to this lecture, I may not get the information, and then I won't do well on my test, and then I'm going to get a bad grade, and blah, blah, blah. So they're able to kind of understand all the different ramifications. Children with ADHD, not so much. For them, it's either now or not now. It's not interesting to them, forget it. They're going to move on to something else. And they also have, difficulty kind of filtering out what's important, what's not important, right? So everything is interesting. If like, for example, if they're sitting there and they're listening to the teacher teach a lesson on math, and suddenly they look around the room and they see a friend eating a snack. Oh, that's interesting. They're kind of hungry, so maybe they want to know what the friend's eating. And they looked out in the hallway and they see another student running down the hallway. Oh, I wonder what's going on. Why is he running? They look out the window and they see a group of kids playing outside during recess. Oh, I kind of like that. I want to be outside. So there are so much visual, auditory, kinesthetic, all kinds of stimuli coming at them, especially in busy settings like schools, classrooms, communities, even at home sometimes. And so for them, it's really hard to kind of block out what's important, what's not important to pay attention to. And then also sustaining. So again, it kind of goes hand in hand with the ability to stay focused, is because they really have trouble, especially with something that they're not interested in, is maintaining that focus. And then, staying with that particular topic for a long period of time. Vigilance is not their strong suit. They have a really difficult time maintaining their mental energy to just kind of look at that one thing. And then shifting is moving from task to task, switching from one to another. Children with ADHD, sometimes it's really hard for them to pay attention in the first place. So once they worked really hard to pay attention to something, but for some children, by then their class has already moved on to something else, and now they're having to disrupt that and then having to shift. That's really difficult. So we do see a lot of that. Another area that's really challenging is, like what I just said, is the transitions. Is that a lot of times we do see that some children, as we talked about earlier, is that they will find something that's really interesting, captivating, and they suddenly hyper focus onto that one task, and it's hard to get them to pull away from it. So in schools, as you know, many of you who have children know that in school there are schedules that they have to follow. You go from, learning math, for example, in the morning, to moving on to like ELA, and then you've got to move on to going to specials, and then you come back and maybe you got to get ready to go to lunch. And then, so there's a lot of different activities throughout the day where they're constantly having to shift and transition. And it's really difficult for children with ADHD to do that well, because it's so hard for them to get their brain to the point where they can kind of focus on what's going on. And then because it takes them so long, other kids have already moved on or gotten started. They're still trying to get started. And then finally, once they got started, suddenly, oh, you've already spent 20 minutes trying to get yourself settled. And now after 20 minutes, we're moving on to something else. Okay. So it's really hard for them to keep up with all of that. The other challenge that we see is the struggle to follow instructions. And this really taps into working memory. You know, a lot of times children with ADHD do actually have very good working memory when they are in an optimal setting where there's not a lot of distractions, when it's quiet, one-on-one. They can do really good work. They're able to remember information and recall information. But then when you put them in real life, when there's a lot going on, the busyness of the classroom, the busyness of family life, community, and so forth, suddenly their working memory is shot because they are distracted and they're attending to so many things that they're not able to hear the directions that are given to them. And I do want to talk a little bit about what working memory is, because sometimes people think working memory and short-term memory are the same things, and they're not. You know, short-term memory is basically you have like about roughly 30 seconds with short-term memory. So basically, whatever information that you get, you remember it right away. If you don't, then you lose it. So, you know, I'm sure all of us have been in that situation when we go to a party and someone introduces his or her name, and then suddenly we forgot what their name was, right? So that's sort of like short-term memory. Like you can't really regurgitate back that information. Now, with working memory, it's a little bit more complex than short-term memory in that not only you having to retain that information in a short span of time, you're having to use that information, tap into that information, process it, and then using it to problem solve or to do a task or whatever it is that you're having to do. So for children with ADHD, typically working memory is an area that you hear all the time is, you know, I will give him some direction or instruction, and next thing you know, he turned around, he completely forgot what he had to do. And you're having to kind of repeat yourself quite a bit as parents or teachers. And they also don't remember where they keep their things. They also, you know, have a difficult time, like for example, with multiple steps. So like if you give them 3 things that they're having to do, they probably heard maybe 1 out of those 3 things. And then next thing you know, you're having to keep reminding them. Okay, so that happens quite a bit. And I see that all the time. Also, like for example, you know, with processing speed, that's another area that's impacted, is that they're having to do tasks, like simple tasks, quickly and efficiently, because there's a tendency to get distracted. They can't do problems quickly and efficiently because they're constantly zoning in and out, either external or internal distractors going on. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, so we hear a lot about, you know, executive functioning. That is really significantly impacted. You know, I think many of you already know executive functioning is typically housed in the frontal lobe of your brain. This is where a lot of the planning, the controlling of impulses, the, you know, sort of keeping things organized, understanding consequences, prioritizing, that's all housed there. And typically, you know, children who have ADHD tend to have trouble with activation. So what that means is organizing, prioritizing, and getting started or initiating work. They also, of course, have trouble with the focus. So not only are they having trouble with focusing on what they have to focus on, they also have trouble sustaining or staying with that topic for a very long time. And then shifting their attention from task to task as needed. We also see trouble with putting in effort. So they may have trouble regulating their alertness. They also have trouble with adjusting their processing speed according to what tasks that they're having to do. Emotional dysregulation is huge. It's because they are so frustrated, they couldn't get things done. So sometimes there's this over-the-top reaction, have trouble with modulating those emotions, keeping them in check, utilizing working memory and accessing recall of information, another area of challenge, as well as kind of monitoring and regulating their own actions. So a lot of times kids who are blurting out in class, or, suddenly they see something outside that they want to go look at, they'll jump out of their seat and go to the window and look outside, not understanding that they are disrupting their peers, they're disrupting the teacher from teaching and all kinds of things. Okay, I think this part is really interesting. A lot of times, I hear a lot, especially in schools, where parents will say to me, I don't get it, It's like, it's not a big deal. And suddenly he's got this full-on tantrum. He's on the floor screaming and crying. And I'm kind of like, what was the big deal? And parents don't always understand, what is it about children with ADHD where they are so emotionally unregulated or dysregulated. So I kind of want to touch on some things. So flooding or emotional flooding, and I don't know if some of you have heard that terminology. What that is that it's just like another word for over the top, this explosive reaction to something that's really minor. Okay. It's sometimes it's building up, and suddenly it just kind of explodes. And parents sometimes like, where did that come from? And the reason that happens, and that's directly related to the little rectangle underneath that, is that for some reason their brain cannot distinguish the difference between big problem versus little problem. Like everything is like very intense. Everything is like a threat. And so it's almost like their brain is just very hyper vigilant. And whether it's, spilling a glass of milk to flunking a test. Both of those incidences are very different in terms of level of seriousness. Like, okay, I spilled some milk, big deal. I'm just going to clean it up. Whereas, flunking the final on your, whatever end of the year test was a big deal. For them, those two things feel like the milk feels just as threatening as failing a test. For some reason, everything is such a big deal. And it's really hard for them to figure out, well, what's big and what's small, what's little problem, big problem. And, sometimes I do consult with parents and talk to parents about teaching their children to categorize what's a little problem and what's a big problem. When do you go for help for big problems? What can you do? What are some coping strategies to help you deal with little problems on your own? And then there's also something called rejection sensitive dysphoria. What that is that I hear this all the time, is that they have this fear, and it's all self-imposed, this fear of rejection, of failure. And so a lot of times I hear, well, he will sit there and not get started on a worksheet. And it's hard to know if it's because they don't like the topic that they're working on, or is it because they're afraid of making mistakes. And for them, making a mistake is like a big deal. So they may have 20 math problems, and if they miss one or two, that's like the end of the world for them. And that kind of relates back to the people pleasing. They're constantly wanting to please, they wanting to do well, but they're so afraid to make mistakes that sometimes it inhibits them from moving forward and being productive. And then the dysthymia, that's sort of like the mood, the irritability. Also, I should mention the anxiety, which we talked a little bit about earlier. That's a social emotional component of ADHD that sometimes gets overlooked, but is very common. Is that sometimes, because most children with ADHD are very smart children. They have average to above average, cognitive abilities. However, because their brain does not allow them to function at their full capacity, and they're constantly playing catch up with school, or they're constantly behind, they're late to things, or missing things, or losing things all the time, it's frustrating for them. And so there's this sort of like anxiety that comes with that, as well as, just being irritable and frustrated with where they are. So that's the emotional dysregulation part. And then of course, attending to academic tasks, we see this all the time. It's interfering with their ability to learn, ability to complete schoolwork, to study, do well, and so forth, even though they are very capable. We talked already about, getting started as something that's really challenging, because if they're not interested, they're going to procrastinate. Fear of failure, going back to what I said about earlier with rejection sensitive dysphoria, persisting. So for them, anything that requires a lot of mental energy, a lot of persistence, pushing through, doing hard things, they don't have that ability to do that. So the minute things get hard, they're moving on to something else, because for them, it's in the here and now. They don't want to think about, well, if I work through these math problems now and practice, I'm going to do well on my test on Friday, right? For them, that concept doesn't really exist. And then also learning from past mistakes, that is really challenging. They may make mistakes and they don't like it, but they don't always kind of use that opportunity to help them do things differently the next time. So it doesn't always help them when they make those mistakes. And so a lot of times, either they don't want to do it at all because they're afraid of making the mistakes, or they keep making the same mistakes over and over. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop for a second just to see if anyone has questions about any of the challenges before I move on to solutions and strategies.
This has been so amazing. We do have some questions in the chat. So Caroline said, I'm a long-term MCPS substitute teaching in general music and elementary school, working with 400 students a week from pre-K to 5th grade. There are no other music teachers on campus. I'm anxious about managing student behavior in class, as well as contacting parents and knowing what to say. Thank you. Do you have any advice for her?
Oh, well, thank you so much for doing the work that you do. I know that it can be really challenging for teachers who are teaching specials classes like music and PE and art, where they're having to teach almost the entire school, really. And so I really appreciate the work that you do. I think it's important. We always say that the first couple weeks of school, really, those 2 weeks of schools are really important for setting structures and routines and expectations. Obviously, it varies from different grade levels. Some children may need more time to get into those routines, but I would recommend that you spend that time teaching those children what your expectations are for your class, what the routines are, and practice those routines so that they are well rooted, so that after that period of time, you're actually able to teach. Because when we don't have those down, then you're constantly just managing behaviors. It's like, you're constantly putting out fires and you're not able to do quality teaching. The other thing I would want to add is that a lot of times children who have accommodations or, have IEPs, typically like the coordinator, the 504 coordinator, or the case managers, I would make sure you get with those folks to kind of have an idea of, who their children are, which children you need to think about providing accommodations for, like, and you probably will learn that as, you kind of observe at the beginning of the year to see, oh, I can't really sit Johnny with Susie because both kids are bouncing off the walls, so they can't really be next to each other. So things like that, but just kind of having the heads up on which children need accommodations, any sort of seating preferences, things like that would be really helpful going into the school year. Any other questions?
Caroline also commented that there isn't behavior training for long-term or short-term substitutes, and they're often on their own. And Caroline also asked if a student seeks a lot of special attention, is that ADHD or autistic? And then I actually commented on that saying that using neurodiversity affirming language, another way to describe that is connection seeking. And that's connection seeking is something that a lot of children do, ADHD, autism, many different neurotypes, including neurotypical children. I'm a speech language pathologist, and I'm very excited that you're here. So thank you so much for coming. And I just want to, is there anything else that you want to add to that?
No, you're
Okay.
absolutely right. Connection seeking is certainly sort of a more strength-based language to talk about. It's hard to say, reasons why children are seeking those connection. It's hard. I don't typically put a diagnosis on a child based on just one or two behaviors. It typically would require, more of a comprehensive approach to kind of have a better understanding of, reasons why that child was needing more support from the teacher and so forth. But it could very well be, both, could be one or the other. I think sometimes children, like we talked about, like I talked about earlier, is like a lot of times I hear that a lot of students with ADHD do have trouble with persisting or attempting tasks on their own. They just kind of want to go straight to the teacher and say, I need help, without even attempting. And so I think for those children, it's important to really teach them to develop that level to kind of build that level of frustration, that threshold a little bit more. Encourage them to try it, attempt it, maybe make it less overwhelming for them so that they're more likely to try or attempt on their own. So one of the things that I like to recommend is that instead of giving a child an entire worksheet of like 30 problems, that can be very overwhelming for a child. And so if you want to promote that sense of accomplishment and independence, maybe cut that worksheet down to just half or a third, or just highlight maybe 3 or 4 problems for them to try and say, hey, why don't you try these 2 or 3 problems first, and then come check in with me, and then I can kind of let you know if you're on the right track. So chunking, that's a really good way to kind of promote that. So, those are some strategies and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some strategies in a little bit, but that's a really effective strategy to try to promote more independence and build their persistence.
That's
I'm looking.
great advice.
Thank you. And I'll talk a little bit more when we go through some of the strategies. I'm kind of looking at the time, and I want to make sure that I get to all the slides and answer more questions at the end, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah.
So, we talked a little bit about transitions can be really challenging. And so one of the things that can be really helpful, although it's not always helpful for every student, but for, many of the students that that we see in the schools, is that giving them time to prepare their brain to slowly pull away from an activity so that they are able to prepare themselves to move on to the next activity can be very helpful. So you can use a visual timer, or you can use an auditory timer. Something as simple as a timer on your phone can help. And you can say in very positive language, Annie, you have 5 more minutes to spend on your drawing. And then when the timer goes off, we're going to clean up. Right. So just kind of giving them that sort of a heads up. School age children sometimes don't have a very clear understanding of the concept of time. So telling them, oh, you've got 5 minutes and we've got to clean up, it doesn't really always go over very well, because to them 5 minutes could mean 15 minutes, right? So having some kind of visual external aid like a timer can be really helpful to kind of help them manage knowing when to stop and when to start something else. Another good strategy that I usually recommend to teachers or even parents is give them a really specific stopping point. So for example, at home, let's say your child is really into building Legos and he's already spent 2 hours doing Legos. It's now dinner time. So something that you can say to your child is, okay, I see that you're working on this car. Once you put the wheels on all 4 wheels on the car, that's a really good time to pause. We're gonna stop there and we're gonna wash your hands and get ready for dinner. You can come back to that a little bit later. And it's important to kind of use language that lets them know that you're not taking their favorite activity away from them completely. Is that all you're simply doing is just putting a pause on it, and then you get to come back to it later. And that could be really helpful. It's giving them very specific stopping points so that they know, okay, I've already put in on 3 wheels. I need 1 more wheel. After that, I'm going to stop. And sometimes it's more satisfying for them to be able to complete something so that they feel good about it before they can actually stop. Sometimes they're in the middle of building something and they just got to get that done, and you telling them you got to stop, that could be a trigger. And then you could have this whole host of other things that could be happening behaviorally. And then for some children, it may be helpful to help them get started on the task. Just sitting next to them or maybe working collaboratively with them to get started on the next task. So let's say, for example, in the school setting, if the teacher wants this child to get started on their math worksheet, maybe sitting with the student, making sure he knows how to do the first 2 problems and then turn it over to him. So that once they feel comfortable and confident, they're able to keep going. Same thing at home. Let's say you have your child go upstairs to clean up and say, okay, I want you to go up and pick up all the toys off of the floor. Maybe you can go up with your child. You guys can start picking up a couple of items together and then turn it over to your child to do the rest. So that can be really helpful. With regard to following instructions, I think some of these strategies are pretty kind of commonsensical. But sometimes we forget because we're busy and we're in a hurry and we want to get things done. And so we forget that if your child or if the student is in the middle of doing activity, that is not a good time to be giving them instructions for the next activity, because I can guarantee you they're not listening. So you want to wait until they're done with whatever activity. Make sure that you are at eye level. If it's a small child, at eye level, making sure they are looking at you. Of course, that's cultural as well. So eye contact is not necessarily an absolute, but in this day and age, in the Western culture, eye contact, making sure that they hear you because they are looking at you, or at least that they are in close proximity to you so that you know that they are attending to what you're having to say. Sometimes making a checklist could be really helpful. So for a child who doesn't read yet, you could certainly have some visuals there to kind of help them know what they have to do. Obviously, if they're reading, you can do like a simple little checklist so that if you're sending them upstairs and say, okay, I want you to go upstairs, pick up all the toys off of the floor, make your bed, come downstairs and set the table. That's a lot of instruction for a child to have to remember. So a short little list could be really helpful to help them kind of key in what they have to do. And again, same thing with getting them started on the first step together could be really helpful. We talked a little bit about executive functioning. Some key things to help is to externalize time or to have external aids, bringing the future or the past to the present. Because remember, their concept of time is in the here and now. It's either now or not now. And then kind of making sure that they are motivated along the way. So I kind of want to go a little bit into each area, externalizing time. So what does that mean? Is that, a lot of times kids with ADHD and even adults tend to underestimate the amount of time it takes them to get something done because they are so distracted, because sometimes they have a hard time getting started. They may go into their room with the full intention of finishing an essay and 2 hours gone by and they hadn't even written one paragraph, right? Because they're distracted by other things that's going on in the room. They could be looking up some information about their essay. Next, you know, something else popped up on their computer and they're like, oh, that looks interesting. And so they're like meandering through it. So some of the things that we can think about is making sure that they have, you know, an environment where they're not distracted. Nowadays, it's really hard to keep technology away from students because they are using technology to do schoolwork. But certainly you can certainly think about, you know, limiting what they can access, you know, having them be in a space where you are able to keep an eye on things. If you're noticing that, okay, they're now on a website that has nothing to do with their history lesson, you know, that's something that you can kind of bring them back. Sometimes, you know, having something that's written out, making sure that they are able to manage time with like planners. I know that in schools, sometimes kids are given planners, but they don't even look at them. And one of the things that I really encourage parents who have third, fourth, fifth graders is to start teaching them how to use those planners. And sometimes parents say, well, they come home and they don't have any homework. What's the point? Well, the point is you're teaching them good habits. You're teaching them to write things down, to kind of be accountable for it. Even if they have no homework, they can just put NH for no homework on their planner. And that way they can come home and say, okay, I didn't have homework in math today, but it's written down. And you know, this sort of habit really goes a long way into adulthood because as adults, you know, we work, we have work deadlines, we have meetings, we have all kinds of things that we have to keep track of. And most of us who do those things successfully have some tool to kind of help us keep track of all those things, right? And so it's important for us to teach our children those same habits. And it could be a digital planner, it could be like an actual paper planner, whatever it is that's helpful. That's really something that I usually advise, as well as timers. And so you can have a child sit down and say, okay, I'd like for you to spend 10 minutes, just 10 minutes on this worksheet, and then we're going to stop and take a little break. So that's really helpful to have something like that. Building motivation. So, you know, again, persistence is really challenging. And so it's really important to build in those breaks so that they have something to work for. You know, making sure that they are with partners or with peers who are productive, positive role models, you know, using different methods for them to demonstrate their abilities, their academic skills, always recognizing when they are trying, and then always praise effort over performance. I know sometimes it's really hard as parents, we want our kids to make straight A's all the time. But it's also important to celebrate when they are putting in the effort, when they are, you know, able to kind of work through some difficult problems. It's not always about getting the right answer. It's about, you know, taking the time to think through and putting in the effort and really caring about your work. Other things that could really help for children, you know, to kind of create a more optimal environment. Um, Fidgets is on the list. It's sort of sometimes it can be very helpful and sometimes it can actually add to the problem. So you have to know your child well. You certainly can give it a try. You know, if they're able to listen to a teacher teach at the board by, you know, having their fingers or their hands busy with a quiet fidget, and if that helps them to focus, then that's great. Some kids doodle. I know some teachers get really upset when they look, you know, at their student, they see these students doodling instead of taking notes. They get really upset sometimes, and I have to kind of remind teachers that this is how this child is able to focus, is by doodling. Instead of fidgeting, they're drawing, because that's how they're able to kind of quiet their brain. It's a mindful practice actually to kind of doodle. So you have to kind of really understand the child. And then, you know, noise canceling headphones, if they're willing to use it. Sometimes, you know, older students don't want to put on something like that if it makes them look different. But nowadays I do see kids with headphones all the time. You know, giving choices is really good. Also, students with ADHD who need to get up and move around. Usually sometimes I suggest to teacher, have them run an errand for you. That's a way to get the movement break in. They may need to go to the bathroom. Some kids will make up reasons to get out of their room because they need to move. So why not give them legitimate reasons to move? Build in those movement breaks in your classroom, and it could benefit everybody. And then, preferential seating, sometimes people think, oh, sitting in the front is always the best. Not necessarily. Some children don't do well in the front. Maybe they do better in the back. Some children don't do well next to Johnny. They need to be sitting next to somebody who's more quiet. So it just really depends on that child. And then kind of making the connections, bringing the future, the past to the present, because remember, their concept of time is now or not now. Things to kind of help them remember, to kind of make it more concrete in the present for them. Of course, mindfulness activities, mnemonic devices are really helpful to help them, with the working memory, helping them solidify some of the information. Encouraging older students is setting goals and trying to hit those goals, and they can have that as a reminder for them. And then, visualizing information sometimes can be really helpful for kids who are more visual spatial learners. And then kids who are struggling, I think sometimes it's important to just say gently, I noticed that, you weren't able to get started in the last 10 minutes. What can I do to help you? Or what kind of help do you need right now? Or what do you need from me right now? Or whatever it may be. So calling that out and letting them know that you're there to support them. Quickly, I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about the cognitive brain versus the emotional brain. Is that all day long in schools, kids are being asked to tap into their cognitive brain, but it can really be very exhausting. A lot of times they have trouble with executive functioning, and so it's really hard for them to access that part of their brain. And that's why you see that's easier for them to tap into the emotional brain. Because they have an interest-based nervous system, their emotional reaction time is even more automatic and more intense. So some of the things that we can think about is using proactive rather than reactive approaches. So some of the things that we already talked about, how do you set up an environment so that the child is going to be successful, with some of the accommodations, and then also using really positive approaches, not penalizing children. I think what's important to understand is that these children mean to do well, they intend to do well, they want to put in effort, they want to please. It's just that right now they need a lot of support in getting there. And that they're not being defined, or they're not trying to like derail you or kind of make you upset. It's just that that's how they're built. We just need to understand them and how to figure out how to support them better. And I think it's also, this just kind of talks a little bit about why it's important to understand what is it that's causing your child to be frustrated and upset, right? So what are the triggers? And sometimes less talk is better than too much talk, especially when they're in that moment of when they are not able to really hear you, when they are frustrated and upset and they're dysregulated. Wait it out, let them kind of, calm to the point where they're able to kind of be logical, and then you can come back and talk. But while they're in that moment, talking to them is not only ineffective, but it could possibly trigger them to be even more upset and angry. And just kind of some of the things that I usually talk to parents about is teaching them to be able to kind of express some of those emotions, to kind of come back and say, I was frustrated because I didn't know how to do this one problem, but I was afraid to ask for help. Um, you know, um, you know, being encouraging, and then also giving them very specific strategies. What can you do next time so that you don't rise so that you don't get to this level? Making sure that they are sitting next to people that are going to set them up for success, and not near people who are pushing their buttons and triggering them. Sometimes you have to kind of reduce the workload reduce the demand. So instead of 3 things that they're having to do, 3 chores in 1 hour, let's think about realistically, what is it that I can have my child do in 1 hour? Maybe just focus on 1 task or 1 chore. And then, of course, think about movement, physical activity, screen times. Those are all important to think about. Sleep is important as well. And, not all strategies are going to be effective for every child, but it's worth a try. And then it also comes from the fact that you know your child best. You are the expert on your child. And so a lot of times I say to parents, this may not work for your child, but maybe you can try this. And sometimes you try it, and then if it doesn't work, that's okay. You can try something else. Of course, creating a calm space. So in the moment when they are, having that moment where they are upset, creating a space in your home where it's safe and it's comforting for them to kind of decompress, calm down. And then when they are calm and they're able to come back, that's when you can kind of debrief with them and, talk to them about how things can be a little bit different. And we don't want it to be punitive. So I think that's important. It's not that they are being sent to their room because they did something bad. Okay. I think the language has to be is that I noticed that you're upset. Why don't you go to your calm space and, do what you need to do until you're ready to come back out and we can talk about what happened. And then I think the last thing I want to leave you, well, not the last thing, but next to the last thing I want to leave you with is that sometimes as parents, it's always a sort of negotiation where you're trying to figure out, well, when do I say no and stick with that? And when do I negotiate and compromise? Sometimes it's important that you have to recognize that you are the leaders, teachers, same way, you are the leaders. These children are looking to you for leadership. So it's important to set very clear boundaries and make sure that you follow through with those boundaries. Sometimes no just means no. However, there are other times where you have to pick and choose your battles and you have to compromise. And it's important to teach children how to compromise respectfully. Power struggles are a big no-no. A lot of times I do see that in the classroom where a teacher feels like she is the authority figure, and so she should have the last say, and they get into this power struggle with students, and it doesn't lead to good outcomes. And it also can really impair relationships with that student. And so it's really important to avoid power struggle. Same with parents and children. Give choices when you can, and always be prepared to follow through with whatever choice your child chooses. So if you want to give your child 2 choices for breakfast, make sure that you do have those 2 choices for breakfast on hand. So if they choose one, you are prepared to provide that. And then don't make threats if you're not willing to follow through. So for example, let's say you're in a store and your child is whining because they wanted a candy bar, and you said no 5 times already. And if you ask me again, we are going to leave the store, that's a threat. Now, if you can say that, be prepared to leave the store. Your child asks again. Okay. So those are things that are really important to teach consistency and respect, as well as, the authorities and the boundaries. And ignoring, a lot of times parents and teachers as well have a really hard time with this, is that the child's over there screaming on the floor, kicking furniture, and you want me to ignore that? Yes. The reason is sometimes, again, it goes back to that idea that they are in that moment of high intense emotions. Talking at them doesn't help. I think the best thing you can do is to supervise, make sure they are safe. You remove verbal attention, you remove eye contact, you still want to make sure you supervise, make sure that they are okay. And then you want to remove physical attention. So no hugging them, no touching them, let them be in a safe space until they're ready to come back and talk to you. And then you're going to have to wait it out sometimes. Once your child is calm, you can go back and talk about what happened, and then go through and talk about how things can be done differently, and then give them opportunities for restorative action. So what that means is, let's say your child accidentally threw something in anger and broke it. Once they're calm, you can either help your child or supervise your child cleaning that up. Other restorative actions can be writing a letter, making a card, apologizing. All of those things are really effective in kind of helping them understand the consequence of those actions. And then lastly, this is just sort of like a brief kind of breakdown of services in the school system. If you suspect your child has ADHD, or if your child already has been diagnosed with ADHD, and they are really struggling in their learning environment, you can request supports in the schools or services through either an IEP under special education or a 504 plan. And briefly, the difference between the two is that an IEP is a lot more intensive for children with really severe, moderate to severe ADHD, where there's interfering with their school or learning so much that they are needing specialized instruction. They also get accommodations as well. For a 504 plan, they are still in general education setting, but they are getting accommodations like, environmental accommodations to help, with giving them that flexible seating or extended time or whatever assistive technology that they need in order to do the work, or to be able to kind of access curriculum and to kind of level the playing field. And that's sort of in a nutshell. I can certainly go more into that if you guys have questions or you want to email me. I am happy to kind of email you back with more information. So just a quick, acknowledgement, got information on statistics from CDC. Some of the information from my presentation came from a presentation by Rebecca Brown, as well as this website on understanding ADHD. I don't know if anybody had any specific questions they wanted to ask me, but I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing at this point.